Okay, so as the last speaker standing between you and lunch, I was wondering what to do to keep you here, and when I saw how well received Matt Lindland's presentation was yesterday when he talked about coefficients of inbreeding and everything, I decided to include a large percentage of matrix algebra in my talk to both whet your appetite but keep you anchored to your seats. But all kidding aside, today's topic, as Patty said, is kind of what you heard about, and especially some of yesterday's talks, kind of applied to the practical business of breeding dogs, which is what my primary job is. So in the talk, I won't talk so much about how we measure the traits, although that is in some ways the most important piece of the whole thing. I kind of take off from the point at which we do. Measuring the traits and how the traits get measured and the adequacy of those measures will kind of impact every piece of the talk I give today. But that topic in itself is almost, not almost, it is a separate series of talks that we could be having. But mainly I'll focus on how to calculate genetic merit in animals, in other words, how to select the animals to be your breeders. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how to minimize inbreeding in your breeding colony. So, Canine Companions for Independence is as Patty said, it's where I work. And so our goal, I mean, when you have a breeding program, you need a direction to move in. And so what gives us our direction is the goal. And that is to, maximize the production of successful service dogs. Service dog, when I refer to it in the context of CCI, it's working with a handler who is disabled. The dog accompanies the handler in all sorts of environments. In essence, it accompanies the handler everywhere. And the activities that we want the dog to do include turning light switches on and off, pulling a wheelchair, picking up kind of dropped items, tugging doors open or closed, pushing doors open or closed. And the breeds that we use are Labrador Retrievers, Golden Retrievers, and we also cross or back cross the two breeds. And the first kind of most fundamental question we've got is, why do you have a breeding program? You know, you can get dogs other places besides breeding them yourselves. And I'll tell you, a breeding program, a program like ours costs a lot of money in terms of labor, in terms of veterinary expenses. But we've got a demand. We need to kind of meet the demand for the dogs. We need to produce about 250, 260 graduates every year. Graduate teams, I should say. That's a dog and a person going out the door together. And we've looked at and have and do obtain dogs from other places, but in terms of kind of playing the odds, what are the percentages of success? You'll see there, and I should say that our percentages are fairly typical kind of for similar organizations, for guide dog schools, for other organizations like CCI. When we have in the past kind of done programs where we've allocated staff to working with shelters to screen rescue dogs, and that really, it's less than 1%. It's actually a lot less than 1% of the dogs that staff would screen would actually pass through the program and become actual graduates. When we purchase dogs from breeders, even though obviously we're purchasing dogs that have been screened, they're good, but they haven't been bred for the purpose that we want to use them for, the percentage jumps up to about 12%. When we breed our own dogs, our current success rate is about 45, 46%. I know it says 43 there, but it's in latest generation it's gone up very slightly. And so the sheer kind of, shading things to get the most successful result, and economically it makes sense for us to have a breeding program because that gives us a predictable supply of dogs. It's many of you, I want to get through this talk fairly quickly because time is short, but many of you know the story of the San Francisco SPCA that recently got out of the hearing dog program, and they really got out of it for a good reason. Their mission is really to kind of rescue, rehome dogs. They're unwanted. Their hearing dog program, as admirable as it was, no longer competed with the programs that produce dogs specially for people with that sort of disability. And so I think they took a lot of flack for that decision, but I think it was a wise decision because people with hearing loss or who are deaf can be better served and more rapidly served by organizations that are producing dogs that are specially bred for that purpose. As you've gathered, we've got a large population. We want 250 graduates. We also need, as you'll no doubt figure out, replacement breeders to keep the generations going. So we need, we need to produce about 680, 690 suitable animals each year. And that's a real different, many of you are breeders who probably produce a couple of litters a year. And while in many ways we're looking for very similar things, the difference between producing like a couple of really perfect litters versus 680 puppies, which is about 95 litters of suitable dogs, are different, significantly different problems. And it's a kind of a mixed blessing. There are good things about that, and there are also real problems. So once we know how many dogs we need to think about, okay, so what are the objectives? So obviously we want to produce service dogs, or we want to produce breeding stock to produce service dogs. So what does that mean? The dogs need to be physically, medically sound. They need to be the right size for the purpose we want to use them for. And as I said earlier, retrievers kind of fill the bill there. They need to be long-lived. I've italicized that because we don't breed for kind of longevity per se. There's a good study I'll mention later that looked at that, and in populations like ours, that doesn't tend to be a highly heritable trait. And they need to be behaviorally suited to the work. And what that means in the CCI world is they need to adjust well to transitions in housing. They go from breeder caretaker's home to a puppy raiser's home to a kennel, and then to a graduate's home. And so there are several transitions there, and that's not every dog's kind of cup of tea, so to speak. It needs to, our population needs to do that, and they need to be happy about it. And again, labs and Goldens typically are happy to make new friends. They need to be able to learn what we need to teach them in the kind of 6-month time frame we use to train our dogs. They need to be ultimately controllable by voice commands. They need a fairly high arousal threshold. In other words, when small animals run by, when loud noises occur, they can't flip out. They need to kind of keep chugging along, doing what they're doing. And obviously, as I said before, since they go so many places, they need to be comfortable in a wide variety of environments. So let me tell you a little bit about the breeding colony at CCI, because this also drives many of our decisions. But first, let me get some water. Our colony is a closed one. And the advantages that offers are probably obvious to everyone. It gives you complete control over the genetic material that you've got, so that you know, with a little bit of time, a couple of generations, you have a good idea of what alleles are segregating through your colony. Harmful alleles are that much more quickly obvious what's going on. Homozygosity is obviously going to be increasing, and the plus side of that is that that's how you're selecting for traits. You're hopefully fixing advantageous traits, and kind of by definition, what you're doing is you're increasing homozygosity. However, we also use crossbreeding and backcrossing programs to destabilize the kind of the genetics a little bit and give us certain variation. Specifically, we want to take kind of desirable traits from one breed and kind of introgress or introduce those traits into the other breed that we're using. So the ideal there is we're getting the best of that both breeds would have to offer. As one of the speakers said yesterday, that can easily backfire on you depending on how you choose the parents. There was the Labradoodle example that sounds like it didn't work out so great. And we also maintain kind of subpopulations of purebred labs and purebred Goldens to kind of promote a certain consistency of the genes that we're inferring from the phenotype that are there that describe or create characteristics that are favorable. And that should make more sense to you as I go along. So you've got two kinds of traits, and what the kind of trait determines how it's handled, or at least how we handle it, and how it's handled genetically in terms of assessing, how you're going to choose this breeding stock. You've got simple traits, and forgive me if this is overly simplistic, but I didn't want to assume anything if I could help it. Simple traits are these simple Mendelian inheritance, one or a couple of genes that are kind of causing it. It's a trait that's either there or it's not there. Typically, the environment is not playing a role. It may play a trigger role, but the environment is not interacting a lot with whatever the condition is. In our colonies, good examples of those are exercise-induced collapse and PRA. Other kind of trait that you have, obviously, if it's not simple, it's complex. They're polygenic traits. In other words, a number of genes contribute to the degree to which they're expressed. Environmental factors do play a role in how and to how much the trait is present, and it's evaluated in terms of, the trait that is evaluated in terms of, so what's the mean level of that trait that you have in your population, and what's the variance about the mean, and it's that variance that you're going to use to select your breeders. In other words, you want to push the trait in one direction or another. You're going to select breeders who can be responsible for the variance to the side of the mean that you want. I should tell you that simple traits are really, it's a simple frequency count, and it's segregating in your pedigree. In other words, how many dogs in a particular litter do you see that are affected by exercise-induced collapse, say. It's not, how much is each one, but whether they are or are not. So it's a frequency count versus a mean of a level. So in selecting for simple traits, there are a couple of ways to do it. Pedigree analysis is the traditional way. You look at who's affected throughout your pedigree, and you can make some probabilistic calculations in terms of who's probably a carrier, who's probably clear. Affected is obviously, in the case of a recessive trait, is obvious. That's what you're seeing. What you can also do to answer some of those questions, and we heard about this yesterday too, is test breedings. That's not something we engage in much at CCI, but we have historically done some of it. Breeding dogs to a known carrier to see what they produce, to see if the mate of the known carrier is itself a carrier or not. And now, obviously, more and more we can test the disease-causing genes directly. And exercise-induced collapse again, or PRA again, is in Labradors are good examples of that, because there now exist genetic tests, and we can simply test to see if somebody's clear, whether they're carrier, in other words, they're heterozygous for the trait, or whether they're going to be affected. And when you're figuring out whether to breed these dogs that you've tested. Clearly, if they're a carrier, they can be bred. You wouldn't want to breed them to another carrier, assuming you don't want to produce affected offspring, but they can be bred to a clear animal. And the advantage that allows you, obviously, is you can maintain the other genetic diversity that's present in that animal. In other words, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you're carrying a trait that if homozygous in an offspring is deleterious. Now, selection for complex traits is as the name implies, more complex. And here's I pulled this illustration because I like it out of the International Guide Dog Federation kind of cooperative breeding manual that's put together. You've got two dogs, and this is illustrating the phenotype, what you see, versus the underlying genotype, the genetics that's influencing this trait. So you've got dog A, and it's being trained in a school by a trainer who's got 6 years of experience. It is produced by a puppy rearer or puppy raiser who's raised already 5 successful dogs. In other words, what you're thinking there is, wow, this person is experienced, so they know what to do correctly. They're probably contributing to what you see here. And when you have the trainer fill out a temperament profile, it's described as a relaxed worker, good work pattern, very confident, responsive. By the way, those are all positive characteristics in our world, so you'd be liking that dog. Versus dog B, when you get this dog's profile, some insecurities are described by the trainer. In other words, maybe it's environmentally sensitive in a couple of environments. It understands the work. In other words, it's learning what the trainer is teaching, but in performance, it's not as reliable as dog A and tends to be less responsive to the trainer's direction. But it was trained by an apprentice, a new trainer, and it was the first dog raised by a volunteer puppy raiser. So in other words, less experience in making dogs successful. So how you have these 2 different phenotypes, you just pick the better dog and say, this is the dog I should breed with. Well, obviously you all know the punchline. The answer is going to be no. You need to try to determine what's the genetic capability of those dogs that underlie those 2 different phenotypes. So what you can do through the matrix algebra that I've promised to show you, but I want the suspense to build, you're going to find out, okay, so I'm looking at phenotypic value. I want to somehow partition that into genotypic value and environmental effect, or everything that's not genotypic value. And you might, assuming you can do this, determine that dog A, even though it looks better phenotypically, actually has a worse genotypic value than dog B. And so the whole secret to kind of selecting breeders is to try to make that determination. How do we figure out that determination that I've just said is the whole secret? Well, we calculate estimated breeding values. And so the first thing we need to do to go further is we're going to restate that problematic that I just gave everyone mathematically. And we're going to say, look, P sub I here is the phenotype that we're seeing, that temperament discussion that we just saw with dog A and dog B. Then that Greek letter mu is the population mean, and that's kind of the common population, the common environment that both those dogs share. They're both born about the same time. Maybe they're both the same sex. That's what I mean by that. Then A, that's the breeding value that we're interested in. That's the additive, technically speaking, that's the additive genetic component. And then there are errors due to 2 different trainers rating these dogs, perhaps, or imperfections in rating, or genetic components such as dominance between alleles that aren't captured in the additive genetic. We can throw those all into that kind of catch-all E term. So we've kind of reconfigured or rejiggered that description mathematically. So what is an estimated breeding value? So it's a prediction for the animal's genetic merit, that additive genetic value, for a particular trait, okay? And it's using performance data from not only the animal, but importantly from all the relatives that you have available in your population. And that really is in large part, in the main part, how you're going to really determine what's genetic and then what's everything else, what's environment, what's a result of the trainer or the puppy raiser or everything else. And part of what you need to do is to minimize the variance of within this group of animals that you're comparing. And so you create what population geneticists call a contemporary group. And those are animals that share many of the same characteristics. So perhaps it's the same sex, born within the same, in CCI's analysis, they're born in the same calendar quarter of a year. They've got perhaps similar management routines, and a difference between CCI, for example, and some of the other schools is that we've got 5 different training centers. And so when I do this sort of analysis on dogs within CCI, a characteristic of the contemporary group for certain characteristics, actually honestly for all characteristics, is the training center that they're associated with, whether it's in California, for example, or in Ohio or in Florida. So you try to capture the kind of relevant population segment as part of your model that you're making. So less important for our purposes today, the EBV is typically for a single trait, typically expressed in the units that the trait is measured in, and that is expressed as differences from the population mean that we talked about before. And, you know, this third bullet point actually is fairly important. You know, you're not establishing an absolute value for all time for this particular animal. A, EBVs change over time. B, it's important to always keep in mind that, for example, everything I'm talking about today is always going to be relative to the population that you're analyzing. In other words, when I say something about a CCI dog, you know, that doesn't even mean it's true for all Labradors, much less all dogs in the world. It's really calculated against the population that you've got. Okay, so going from behavioral ratings to breeding values is a kind of a fun pre-lunch work example that I've got for us. So again, just to restate things, you've got observed behavior that you're looking at, and then what you want to tease apart is what did the environment contribute and what did this animal's kind of underlying genetics contribute. And as I kind of alluded to before, the genetic contribution gets partitioned into, technically speaking, it's called dominance, epistasis, and then additive effects. And really the only thing that you can affect through breeding is the additive part of that. So what we want to do is we want to get that G A sub I out, into that. That's our breeding value, and then everything else we're basically shoving into that E term, which is why it's starred in that second row. So now I'm going to give you another word, beloved of animal scientists, BLUP, best linear unbiased prediction. That's what we're doing, and that's what you can brag about when you go home. And I've purposely chosen a linear trait to look at, or a pseudo-linear trait to look at. And the beauty of this is that somewhat counterintuitively, you're able to calculate both the environmental and the additive genetic component simultaneously, okay? And as I said before, you're able to pull in all the information you have on the animal's relatives, and so you're not just looking at the animal in front of you. Okay, so we take that equation that I just showed you and we rewrite it in terms of matrices. And I'm going to blaze through this because A, it's coming up on lunch, and B, you don't really need the whole thing, except Y is the observed effect. B is what are known in statistics as fixed effects, the shared environment and some of the other things I talked about before. A is the vector of animal effects. In other words, those are your EBVs, those are your breeding values. E, as I said, is kind of a catch-all where all the residual effects get dumped into. X and Z are design matrices, which are less important for our purposes right now. So you rewrite that in matrix form, and you get this kind of big mess here. The important thing to note is that, you know, the two new terms that you see on this page that you didn't see on the previous page, previous slide, is the inverse of capital A and alpha. Alpha is calculated by using the heritability of the trait, which is an important measure, and then A is that matrix, and this is what allows you. It's called the numerator relationship matrix. You actually need the inverse of it, but the numerator relationship matrix mathematically is not so important to you today, but what is important is to understand that that's what allows you to bring in, and you'll see it when we actually put numbers to this example, but that's what allows you to bring in all this kind of information on relatives relative to this trait that you're interested in. So here's our sample. I've made up this fake pedigree of 8 animals. I've only used, because this is a simple kind of example that I want to illustrate a couple of things with, I've only used one fixed effect, sex. We're going to have males and we're going to have females. We've only evaluated one trait, a trait we're going to call responsiveness. Higher is better in the case of this trait. And we've recorded one observation per animal. Okay, so very kind of straightforward, simple thing. So in the left-hand column, you've got the ID number of each animal. Then you've got their names. Then you've got the sire and dam. Where you see an X, the sire and dam are unknown. then you have the sex of the animal, and then you have the score on this, this test, this responsiveness test. And again, under score, you'll notice the first three animals, they probably come from outside the colony, or the test didn't exist, or whatever reason, there's no score available for these first three animals, okay? Then you get, starting with animal 4, Don, you've got a score of 5.5. Continuing on down through Hero, another male, you've got a score of 6. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over this, but there are ways to calculate the inverse of A. This is all done, by the way, on computer programs with real pedigrees. But for anyone who's interested, it can be done manually as long as your set is small enough. So you set up this matrix. The important thing I'll point out just one thing. The math is really unimportant, except you'll notice that there's a kind of a diagonal row that runs on that bottom 8x8 matrix. There's a diagonal row that runs from the upper left to the lower right, and that's known, as you might expect, as the diagonal. And then everything that doesn't lay on that line are the off-diagonal elements, and it's the off-diagonal elements that allow you to see that you're looking at information on relatives. The diagonal is basically the animals themselves. The extra information this technique is allowing you to get are coming in via those off-diagonal elements. So we calculate the inverse of A, and the only important thing for you guys on this slide is to know that I've kind of arbitrarily chosen a heritability of 0.2 to use with this example. In real life, the heritability for this measure that we call responsiveness is actually far less, which is why in reality we don't actually use this measure in breeding estimation. But, so you don't need to know exactly how these equations get rewritten. The only thing, again, if you look at that kind of second to right column, that's what we're solving for. Those two little B hats that are on top there, those are the fixed effects, and the fixed effects, as you all know, are the sex, and so there's B1 with a little hat over it. That's the value ultimately that we want for being a male in general. This B2 is being a female in general, and then the 8 animals I gave you, that's A1 through A subscript 8, those are the individual breeding values of the animals. Okay, so we do a little bit of matrix algebra, and then we come up with that solution. And you'll notice that we've solved for the fixed effects. The male has an average solution of 5.35. The female has an average solution of 4.5. So just by being a male, in terms of this characteristic, is slightly better. And then the animals all have individual values. Now, what you'll notice is that when you look at the EBVs, so some really cool things about it are, if you look at the yellow arrows, the animals that didn't themselves have a score are able to get a score assigned by virtue of the information available through their relatives. So even though males 1 and 3, for example, weren't exposed to whatever this test was that I'm talking about themselves, we know what their estimated breeding values are relative to the other animals in the population. And that's important. I should also tell you that these things are worked in CCI's case using hundreds or very often thousands of dogs. So the error tends to shrink the greater your sample size is. You would think for a population of only 8 dogs in a pedigree like this, these estimators that I'm using are the error is probably staggeringly high, but still it's more accurate than not having anything. The other thing, if you look at the red or pink arrows, the animals with the highest breeding values, male number 8 and female number 6, they also have the highest score on the test, and so you could have just picked off the score in this case, but very often that's not the case. Very often it's not a direct correlation, otherwise you could just use the score, between the individual trait score and the breeding value of the animal. So that's one trait. Obviously, you're trying to get several complex traits together. I'm not going to force you to work through a selection index, which is a kind of a estimated breeding value for multiples, but there are different ways to balance different traits to get, in other words, to look at more than one trait in making your decision for who's the kind of dog that I want to breed with. You can take one trait at a time. You can kind of say, okay, what's really important to me right now is the hip quality on my dog. So I'm going to look at OFA scores or pen hip scores or whatever. I'm going to get to where I want to be with those, and then I'm going to look at some other trait, fearfulness perhaps, and try to minimize that. That's very slow because you have to make progress in one trait obviously before you're able to move on. And if your traits are all genetically correlated, that it can become problematic, obviously, especially if they're inversely correlated, which some traits are. Another option is joint selection. You can kind of look at your kind of spectrum of traits that you want to select for, and try to independently select the best in each. Obviously, as soon as you start doing it, you run into trouble because you realize, well, gee, this one has the best hip scores, but its temperament scores aren't that great. This one has fantastic temperament scores, but gee, its hips are questionable. And so there's no kind of objective way to maximize the gain in all your traits simultaneously. The technique that does allow you to do that is index selection. Index is, and Larry, maybe you can talk about that over lunch because I'm not going to hit it here. Index is a single estimated breeding value that assigns an overall value to the animal. And what you do is you weight each of your individual traits to come up with this kind of single unitless index. In agriculture, where this is all coming from, typically it's dollars and cents that get used to weight each of the traits, and so certain traits are the more of a specific characteristic, the more profitable the animal is. Inversely, the more of certain traits, the more expensive the animal is to raise. So costs and profits kind of flow into it. With an organization like CCI, we don't have economic costs associated with traits. So what I do is I kind of, not completely arbitrarily, but somewhat arbitrarily, try to decide in conjunction with a group of people. So what's the relative contribution that this particular trait is making to our success, or conversely our failure rate in our population, and then we assign weights that way. So, for example, hips, we tend to weight somewhat less than certain behavioral traits, just because the behavioral traits are in our current population contribute much more to failure than does hip dysplasia. The only final thing is that certain traits we don't select for, and again, when you're putting together, you can think of perhaps 25 complex traits that might contribute to the animal's success or failure. You don't want to be simultaneously selecting for all those traits because your net gain on any one trait will be very close to zero if you do that. So you shrink it down, and in practice you're looking at 3 or perhaps 4 different traits in a selection index, and the others you have to either ignore or accommodate in some other way. Sample heritabilities. I just thought that you might be interested in looking at heritabilities. A guy by the name of John Cole the third row down, did an interesting study at the Seeing Eye on longevity, working life longevity in labs and German Shepherds. And you'll note there that it's defined in a couple of different ways. That the useful way for the heritability that I took, they're barely readable, those numbers, aren't they? The longevity, the third row down, that's 3%. It's 3.2% for working life, and that's post-graduation life. In other words, after 18 months of age, the amount of life the dog has left. How heritable is that? Which is, for us, for our schools, it's a very important characteristic. But you would never want to breed, assuming John's work is correct, and it certainly seems to be, you would never want to incorporate that characteristic into a breeding program, because you're going to be 40 years down the road before you notice any appreciable difference in your population if the heritability is indeed only 3.2%. So inheritability, again, is the variance from the mean within your population that's accounted for with additive genetic values versus, say, environment or error in measurement or something else. So, coming back in where I started, we've got a closed breeding colony. Obviously, if you're selecting, you're narrowing the number of animals that are reproducing, so you're narrowing your total germplasm per generation. So why is inbreeding bad? So as we heard, the kind of the standard and mainly accepted explanation is that, you know, the more you kind of reduce genetic diversity via inbreeding, the more homozygosity you have, so the greater your chances of deleterious copies of possibly, so disease-causing genes might double up. In a more genetically diverse individual, you don't see the negative effects because as a recessive trait, it's being covered up by the dominant copy, the wild type copy of the allele. But in the inbred population, those recessives are now more able to come out. What's interesting, though, is very recently there was some studies on a plant called Scabiosa columbaria in the Netherlands by this Philippine Vergier and her colleagues, and they produced an inbred strain. So inbreeding works with plants, it works with animals, it works with everything. They produced a highly inbred strain of S. columbaria. And lo and behold, a number of characteristics, its fitness went down. They treated the seeds with a demethylating agent. In other words, methylation couldn't take place in either the wild type or the highly inbred strains, and all those inbreeding kind of loss of fitness, the inbreeding depression that was observed, was reversed. And so the take-home message for that is simply that there's probably an epigenetic mechanism working, so in plants at least, and that's part of the mechanism of inbreeding depression. And there's nothing to suggest that shouldn't also be the case in animals. And so probably the story of inbreeding is more complex than simply accumulating bad alleles. There's probably also some other mechanism, perhaps, as this research suggests, epigenetic mechanisms that causes that. However, there was a study done by a guy over in Switzerland, Sylvan Erfer, on Irish wolfhounds. And I quote from his paper, the mean number of pups per litter was six with a maximum of 13. There were no significant differences in either the number of litters or the number of pups. No influence of Wright's inbreeding coefficients over 5, 10, 20, 30 generations was detected. That's kind of the punchline out of the discussion of his paper. And if you look at it, if you remember the talk yesterday about the inbreeding coefficients, how they could be used, I think the maximum was probably something like, I think 12% was kind of the maximum that was suggested. Irish wolfhounds have gone up as high as really 33% inbred, and yet when analyzing this pedigree and trait data, Sylvan Erfer couldn't find any effect of inbreeding. So inbreeding is not a simple thing. Having said that, though, being conservative, it's probably smart to where you can minimize inbreeding. Traditional breeding programs like ours tend to do that via limiting the number of times a male is allocated or bred to females, the number of females each male breeds with before being retired or culled out of the population. What we also do is we have kind of subpopulations of a breeding colony. In other words, we have golden retrievers who tend to be in our population because we have more outside influence coming in from outside breeders, tend to be very lowly inbred. We maintain those in their own kind of colony and then use that genetic material into the lab golden crosses that we produce to reduce the overall homozygosity of that crossbred population. And that's what I mean by using outbred cohorts to cross. And then when you make your individual mate choices, now when you're calculating additive genetic merit or estimated breeding values, if you have, let's just say, for example, 4 sisters, their estimated breeding values are going to be identical until they develop trait measurements on their own. Just by virtue of being sisters, they've got identical values. So it doesn't really matter from a genetic standpoint which one you breed to, which of those four. So you can select if you have DNA marker panels to choose from. You can try to detect the most heterozygous mix between your stud and those four sisters. Pick the sister which at the markers has the most diversity. And there is very recently, you're probably all aware of it, but Mars released the so-called optimal selection product. I won't spend a lot of time on it because probably you've seen the marketing materials, but it has, I forget, 15, 25 different chromosomes. It creates haplotype profiles for your dog, so it gives you this panel, and you've got a panel for the bitch, and you've got a panel for the dog, and you put them together, and you say, these two panels result in haplotype homozygosity or heterozygosity of so much versus, this bitch with this other dog. So that, for the first time, allows you to kind of look at the heterozygosity, at least within these markers that they've chosen, directly. What we do at CCI, the more traditional way, is we calculate for all the dogs or bitches in our population. You calculate a coefficient of co-ancestry between all of those animals, and the coefficient of inbreeding is the same as of a puppy is the same as the coefficient of the co-ancestry between its parents. So if I know the coefficient of co-ancestry between any two dogs, obviously I know the coefficient of inbreeding of that offspring. And so we tend to try to mate to minimize the per generation increase in inbreeding. So the conclusions, again, using blow-up to estimate breeding values offers significant advantages in terms of trying to tease out or maximize genetic gain per information. And really where that comes in is the informational content of the pedigree is really fully exploited in a way that the other techniques don't allow that to happen. Here are some resources, and here's some software packages that at CCI we happen to use, but there are others as well.